We throw this term around of burnout as if it's a unitary construct. But I personally believe that there are two types of burnout phenomena. You can have a burning out phase and you can have a burnt out phase. And the analogy I would draw is to Hooke's law in physics, where it says if you stretch an elastic body within its elastic limits and then let go, it will bounce back. If you stretch it beyond its elastic limits, then it won't bounce back. So I think going through phases of burning out is very common. You might have been a nurse during COVID and worked incredibly long hours, and in which case, having time off, et cetera, may all be very appropriate. But if you've got to that burnt out stage as a consequence of severe stresses and or your personality, then in fact, you're going to need much more than de-stressing strategies. You're going to need lifestyle changes, addressing personality.
What would you then consider to be the tipping point? Clearly there is a threshold somewhere, and I guess the logical question goes to what's that tipping point?
Well, I don't think there's a tipping point for the burning out phase. It's just a level of severity and duration.
Okay.
For the burnt out phase, where there's the loss of elasticity, that's pretty dramatic. So a very famous editor, she described developing burnout, and she was walking across her room. She just fell to the ground, hitting her head on a table. That's Arianna Huffington. Obviously, Freudenberger himself, he couldn't get out of bed. At the end of our book, I describe a professional who was very, very senior in the profession, worked incredible hours. She also couldn't get out of bed. Her family was so worried, they took her to hospital. And no one in the emergency department could work out what was going on. Her blood pressure 60/40, which is very low. She had tachycardia, meaning very fast pulse rate. And she had this profound physical syndrome, a burnout. So that is so dramatic and different when you hear those anecdotes. They are the sort of stories that people describe as their tipping point. Usually the story goes, I woke up one day and I just could not get out of bed. I could not function at all. Cataclysmic.
Welcome to Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz, where academic rigour meets real life. I'm Dr. Stephen Stolz, educator, philosopher and academic at the University of Adelaide, and this podcast series is my quest to help everyday people access research-based ideas that feed curiosity and foster deep thinking. In today's episode, we take a deep dive into one of the most pressing mental health challenges of our time, burnout. In an era of constant connectivity, increasing workplace demands, and blurred boundaries between professional and personal life, burnout has transformed from a buzzword to a critical health and productivity issue affecting millions worldwide. Today, I'm honoured to have with me a true pioneer in understanding this complex phenomenon. Professor Gordon Parker, who's currently Scientia Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New South Wales, joins me. Professor Parker is a renowned psychiatrist and researcher and has dedicated decades to unravelling the intricate psychological and physiological mechanisms behind burnout, helping us understand not just its symptoms, but its root causes and potential solutions. So whether you're a professional feeling the weight of constant demands, a manager concerned about your team's well-being, or simply someone interested in understanding this critical aspect of modern mental health, this conversation promises to be both enlightening and deeply practical. So join me as I bridge the gap between evidence-based research and everyday application. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. Good morning, Professor Parker. Thanks for accepting my invitation to be on my podcast. I want to say thank you for making time in your busy schedule. And I'm quite keen to talk to you on the topic of burnout. And I've read your book with great interest, and I have a lot of questions for you. So my first question I have for you is, and this is more so for people who are not aware of who you are. But if you could maybe introduce yourself, maybe a little bit about your background, your area of experience, and so on and so forth.
So I've been an academic psychiatrist at the University of New South Wales for 5 decades now, and I headed the university department for a while and also the clinical services at one of the hospitals. I established the Black Dog Institute, and I've published a number of books and a large number of papers, and with a focus mainly on mood disorders. But if I'm intrigued by something along the way, I'm always keen to have a look at it. And I think my research profile is probably best distinguished by um, looking at differing models for conditions and seeing if they hold up or whether there's a benefit in their being modified or otherwise challenged. And that certainly holds for the subject of burnout.
5 decades to me, and many people who will be listening to this will say that's a long time. Your role, very demanding, very stressful. How have you been able to kind of sustain that intensity for such a long time? Is there like a little secret or?
I think I was sort of um, running scared for a long period of time. So as an adolescent, I was a bit of a dreamer and a drifter, and I thought that my career aspirations would be based around a surfboard and beaching and whatever. Um, I entered medicine for a number of reasons and went into psychiatry. And once I was in psychiatry, I really loved it. And I was going along at a reasonable pace. And then at the age of 40, I was given the job as being head of the university department, head of a hospital department. I was editing the local journal. I was applying to NHMRC for grants. I was writing papers. I was supervising everybody. And my work days suddenly, became about 80 to 110 hours a week. And that basically changed my personality. And so I've become a very driven guy over the years. And because it's been a very satisfying career, not only just research wise, but being a practicing psychiatrist is incredibly rewarding when you see people who have difficult, severe conditions getting better. And the other aspect about psychiatry is I just admire people's resilience. So I might see a patient and say, how's your week been, Bob? And he'll say, well, my wife left me and the boss sacked me and the dog got run over and our daughter's just got preggers. I guess it's been a bit ordinary, Doc. How's your week been? And my heart goes out when I hear people like that. And it's, I suppose, an old story, but people with severe psychiatric conditions over years have developed a level of armor and they become resilient at a certain level. And they're obviously very courageous on many occasions. And so the long-standing concept of people with a psychiatric illness having some level of weakness or whatever, it generally is completely the other direction. And so they're the things that have held me in the career of psychiatry. And I wouldn't know what to do with myself when I retired, so I'm trying to delay it as much as possible.
Now, the obvious question to ask is, did you suffer from burnout? That's serious hours. They are serious hours.
Yes, and in fact, that's what got me into the into this particular domain. About 5 or 6 years ago, I noticed certain symptoms that I was experiencing, and I wondered what they were. I was becoming quite asocial and self-contained, keeping to myself and so on and so forth. I wondered whether it was depression, but it didn't seem to fit. And so I started doing a bit of reading, and I realized that, in fact, I was experiencing a burnout syndrome. That caused me to start reading, and as an academic researcher, that then got me looking at how it had been defined over time. And as a researcher, I then got all excited about, okay, let's engage in a process of investigating burnout. How is it best measured? How is it best defined? How do we differentiate it from depression? And most importantly, how do we manage it? And so I managed my burnout by doing everything incorrectly, by continuing to work
Mm,
and maintaining the pace, if not at times increasing the pace.
mm. See, I find that fascinating because today I I've experienced burnout on and off for years. In fact, I came across your book by accident and did the Sydney burnout measure, and it was over 100. I remember distinctly going to my GP, and my GP said to me, "Oh, Stephen, you're working too hard." So I took a break, and it didn't make anything better. If anything, it made things worse. So it's your story is eerily similar
Mm.
to mine. It was almost like doubling down, and I'm working harder. So I'm just trying to work out, for my benefit, probably the listeners as well, as where the term burnout actually came from.
Yeah. Yes. So the term was introduced by an American psychologist called Herbert Freudenberger,
Mm.
and he worked extremely long hours as a psychologist. Then on nights and weekends, he would go and help out in a refuge for people with drug addiction. And where the term burnout was used in another context. And then one day when he was going on his holidays, he just couldn't get out of bed. And he couldn't get out of bed for a few days. And he developed such a state. And he therefore felt that burnout quite neatly captured the scenario, but he adopted it from the residents of the refuge.
Oh,
Uh,
okay, okay,
so that's the origin, and that was he wrote a paper in 1974.
okay. And it's somehow the label is stuck ever since.
Yes, well, then it became popularized by the development of a measure of burnout called the Maslick Burnout Inventory.
Mm.
And Maslick is in reference to a psychologist called Christina Maslick, who developed as I said, the Maslick Burnout Inventory, or the MBI, again in the mid 70s. And since then, over 80% of papers that study burnout have used the MBI. So embedding the term burnout within the measure, the MBI, that further popularized the term and distinguished it from other conditions like anxiety, stress, depression.
Is burnout purely a symptom of modern society, or has it existed under other names or conceptualizations in the past, and that we just didn't simply recognize it as the thing we do today? Like,
So almost certainly burnout has existed for centuries. And in fact, in the 5th century AD, there was an epidemic of burnout amongst the monks in Egypt. By and large, as a generalization, they woke up one day and said, "The sun is no longer shining, the sky isn't blue. I've lost my faith in God," and they felt demoralized and weary and exhausted. That was such a frequent phenomenon that it then was listed as a sin and to be punished. And it was listed as one of the 8 cardinal sins. So that would suggest that it was, pretty prominent in those days. And it was only a few centuries later that Pope Gregory joined this sin, which was called acedia, with another sin, trististia, which was depression, joined the two together to create what we now know as there being 7 cardinal sins. But the point I'm making is that it goes way back and was a cardinal sin. In more recent times, then it would have come under other names. So neurasthenia was a very popular diagnosis for decades. Many people would get a diagnosis of a chronic fatigue syndrome and so on and so forth. I think the word burnout has a certain level of attractiveness to it. And um, it caught on both as a word, as a term, and as a nice descriptor of the state. But it's really just putting a new name on a long-standing phenomenon. Phenomenon, presumably, where its prevalence has varied, dramatically. I mean, imagine the satanic mills in industrial England. I mean, everyone working in those conditions would presumably have had burnout. And we know that in parts of Asia these days, extraordinarily high rates of burnout. So, coming back to your question, yes, there's strong evidence that has always existed, but it's had other names. And in fact, you could these days still say, well, why do we call it burnout as against just simply a stress reaction? Because most of the symptoms, not all, but most of the symptoms are the ones that we used to put under the heading of stress reactions, either acute or acute on chronic.
Now that thank you. That's actually very useful. If you, for the sake of the listeners and for myself, just tell us a little bit about the differences between burnout and depression and why they're distinctly different.
Yes. So just to give a little bit of a background, the research world in this area is divided into two groups. One group that basically says burnout is synonymous with depression, and another group that says they're different. I belong to the different school, and the reason for that is that when we first started studying burnout, we gave people with burnout a very lengthy questionnaire, um, over 100 items, and it had 37 depression items. And then we undertook essentially what's called a factor analysis. We identified the key symptoms experienced by those with burnout, and no depression factor came out. We got other factors catching the integral concepts and constructs with burnout, but not depression. So then we've done a number of other studies, and in comparison to most researchers in this area that compare burnout against clinical depression as an overall group, we compared people with burnout to those who had a biological type of depression and those who had a more environmental type of depression, because I firmly believe that there are these two principal types of depression. We found that burnout differentiated most from the biological depression and only narrowly from the environmental depression. So if you just rely on symptoms, then in fact it can be difficult, particularly if you're using a measure, to differentiate the two. And it can often be difficult for clinicians. And it's further complicated by the fact that a high percentage of people experiencing burnout will get depression along with other stress symptoms as a consequence, and therefore they will admit to depressive symptoms. And then in addition, if we look at causal factors, if your burnout has come because you've got a tyrannical boss demanding that you work 80 hours a day and then demeaning you every day that you work, you then can get burnout and depression. What I have found most useful over time is, yes, I look at the symptoms, but I also look at the causes. And basically, burnout is generally caused by excessive demanding stresses, physical, but they can also be in other domains. Whereas environmental depressions in particular are caused by people feeling rejected or demeaned or diminished. So the central construct for depression is to feel hopeless, and for burnout, it's to feel helpless. So I find focusing on the cause of the condition to be more important, actually, than necessarily just going with the symptoms. So you certainly just shouldn't look at the symptoms. If you do that, you run the risk of a misdiagnosis.
Wow, that's very useful. So I just want to clarify. So you spoke about burnout more being linked to hopelessness. I've got that one right.
Yep.
Whereas depression, you're more
So with depression, people feel hopeless.
hopeless.
So
Yep.
if I want to know whether somebody's got a depressed mood, whether it's just a depressed mood or clinical depression, I want them to say they feel depressed, that there's been a drop in their self-worth and self-esteem, feel hopeless, and they feel like giving up and that they've given up. Whereas somebody with burnout, I expect that they'll effectively describe as feeling helpless, that they've got all these stresses that they can't get above and beyond and on top of. but their self-esteem is not intrinsically diminished as part of the burnout syndrome. It can be, as I mentioned, a secondary problem, and it can be a consequence of the burnout. But the primary state differs in that there's not those key depressive symptoms at the front end.
It's interesting you talk about these two camps, so to speak.
Yep.
You see, this is a bit I'm trying to work out. I understand your position clearly. To me, it makes sense. I guess it's a question around causatory here. Direction of causatory is does the depression cause burnout, or is it burnout can lead to depression?
Occasionally, depression will lead to burnout, but that's pretty rare. But
Okay.
can burnout lead to depression? Quite commonly.
I could see why you'd want to separate it out too, because they, to me at least, they seem like two very different
Yeah.
beasts, two different
Oh,
conditions.
it's hugely important because the management of depression as against the management of burnout differ dramatically.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I can understand from a clinical point of view in terms of treatment plans and so on. That makes a lot of sense.
Yes, and in fact, I saw somebody this week who'd been treated for the last 4 years as having depression, been on 9 differing medications and all sorts of things, and actually didn't have clinical depression, had burnout.
Oh,
And so it was a total game changer for him to get that new diagnosis, and he'll therefore get a new management plan. So unfortunately,
wow.
um, clinicians are not always able to distinguish. And certainly, as a medical student, as a training psychiatrist, as a psychiatrist for decades, I had never received a lecture on burnout. So doctors and other health practitioners generally get no education on burnout. So many of these nuances mean that when a patient gets to a GP or a
Mm.
psychiatrist and they have certain symptoms, those with burnout are highly likely to get a diagnosis of depression
Okay.
erroneously and then get the wrong management.
Well, that makes sense because that's exactly what happened with my GP. He said, "Oh, you're working too hard. Go on holiday. Take a break." It obviously didn't do anything. And then when I came back, he said, "Oh no, I think you've got depression." And I was like going, "Oh no, 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 no." Like I looked up the criteria and so on, and I was very skeptical. And I'm glad I was skeptical because the last thing I want to be doing is taking medication. These are pretty serious medications. That's kind of that story you told me is sad, but happy at the same time. That could get the right diagnosis. Getting off those SSRIs I hear is very, anyway, we're not here to talk about SSRIs, but I hear they're almost impossible to get off. So anyway,
No, that's an
is
exaggeration.
it?
There's been
Okay.
quite a lot of press in the last year, particularly coming out of England, and I think there's a little bit of hyperbole in that.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
the SSRIs are generally not that difficult to come off, unless, of course, you've got a depression that's responding to the SSRI. If you come off it, of course, it's going to be difficult.
Oh,
But
okay.
there are some other antidepressants, not in the SSRI class, where withdrawal reactions can be very severe. But they are basically in another class called the SNRIs, not the SSRIs.
I see. I see. I did happen to catch that documentary,
Yep.
which is what I think you're referring to, and
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
scared me. Understandably, and I think it scared a lot of people as well. My next question is: you referred to the personality trait of perfectionism, and
Mm.
so there are many traits which predispose people to burnout. And I just mentioned perfectionism of one of them, and the paradox of I don't like the term healthy or good perfectionism, but where does it tip over into maladjustment or maladaptation or
Well, I need to just give a little background to all of this. The general model for burnout is that it's simply a stress reaction and that there are no intervening variables. So there's a stressful event or a series of ongoing stressful events, you get burnout. Now, for most psychiatric and psychological conditions, we have a differing model. It's called a diathesis stress model. And the diathesis refers to predisposing factors that put you at risk, and the stress refers to the precipitating factors. And so in developing our model of burnout, we've come up with a diathesis stress model. And basically our argument is that certain personality styles are overrepresented in people who get burnout and some are underrepresented. So when I was explaining this to somebody at golf a few years ago, they said, "Oh, Gordon, I now understand why sociopaths never develop burnout." So basically, what we found is that the people that are most likely to develop burnout are, as you say, dutiful, reliable, conscientious, if not perfectionistic. And that those characteristics are overrepresented in those in the caring professions, so doctors, nurses, teachers, and the highest group in terms of prevalence rates of burnout in the caregiving group are actually the clergy. And so that's where people are caregiving and they are required to be diligent and dutiful, etc. That's why they take up those roles. And then you've got another group of lawyers who may not necessarily be intrinsically as caring, but the law demands that they, don't have split infinitives and that they dot every I and cross every T, and therefore perfectionism encouraged. So with that helps to explain why that personality style really increases the risk to burnout dramatically. And the implications of that are huge because you mentioned earlier about what you're told to do in regards to managing burnout, which is basically a stress reduction model. What we argue is that if somebody's got burnout, sure, you need to apply stress reduction strategies. But in addition, are there other factors that are driving the burnout? And if it's perfectionism, then you need to do something about that. That's hard to do because I used to work to the aphorism, you don't treat perfectionists, you employ them because they're hardworking, etc., etc. But if you're going to manage burnout successfully and perfectionism in play, you must do something about it. And that's where the management of burnout has, I think, failed over time because they've just focused simply on the symptom reduction component.
Yeah, so when I was doing some reading and I've done a lot of preparation, I recorded a solo podcast on burnout before this interview, and I'm very appreciative that you came on as an expert in this field to kind of do more of a deep dive on this topic. I remember what shocked me was the personality trait of perfectionism. But then a lot of the treatment, or if you like, overcoming / strategies for overcoming burnout were de-stressing strategies. That always seemed to be the default. And they're very similar to just chronic stress and so on and so forth. So, that's your stress reaction model. And understandably, I can understand why GPs would say, oh, okay, well, we need to look at how we manage our stress, what you can do to de-stress, so on and so forth. But I get the impression that there's a little bit more at play here, that dealing, if you like, with perfectionism could equally have an efficacy or response here that could be just as useful as de-stressing strategies. I mean, are you advocating like now for CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, maybe with a clinical psychologist? Or if you score or rate highly on perfectionism scales, what you would advise?
Somebody simply scoring high on a perfection visit wouldn't mean very much to me unless the perfectionism was getting them into trouble.
Okay.
I mean, you wouldn't want a high court judge that wasn't perfectionistic, for instance, and yet they function at a very high level. So coming back to your question about CBT, there was a meta-analysis done looking at studies evaluating the treatments for burnout. And basically, the meta-analysis showed that most of the intervention studies were CBT-based and they weren't effective. However, the CBT was focusing on the burnout symptoms, and they didn't focus on what I think is the area where CBT becomes germane, and that is the personality style. So if they were to be redone, then I would, and the focus was on in people with burnout who are perfectionistic, if we give good, high standard, sophisticated CBT and modulate the perfectionism and diligence and so on and so forth, is that an effective intervention? I'd be very surprised if it was proved not to be important and influential.
Okay, that's interesting. That's that's really interesting. So it's hard not to note the physiological response.
Well, I think you're asking what's going on at the biological level.
Yeah.
And what we know is that the sympathetic nervous system is activated. That's the fight flight system. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, there's a surge of adrenaline. The parasympathetic nervous system, which is the sort of resting state, that gets compromised. The HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and that releases cortisol, the stress hormone, that comes into play. Studies show either increased cortisol or low cortisol, and I think that's explainable by saying during the acute phase of burning out, you have high cortisol, and when you get to that burnt out phase, you get low. In addition, there's decreased neurogenesis in the brain. That means the development of new nerves that slows down, particularly in the hippocampus, which is the memory source. And so that's why many people with burnout will describe cognitive impairment. In fact, that's one of the key symptoms of burnout. And you also get a reduction in what's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And some parts of the brain can reduce in volume. All of that sounds
Wow.
incredibly dramatic.
Yes.
However, they are all reversible, and that's the key thing to emphasize.
Wow. Yeah, because you mentioned before that once most people burn out, they can return to some level of normalcy, whatever that might look like.
If you're in a burning out phase, that can encompass something that's pretty severe or quite trivial. Because burnout is not a psychiatric diagnosis, in the official classification manual, ICD-11, it's listed as an occupational phenomenon. It doesn't carry much stigma. So in these days, let's say a doctor or nurse going after a very heavy week, instead of saying I'm exhausted, they're highly likely to say, "Oh, I'm burnt out." So that's a dimension, and it ranges, considerably in severity. So therefore, if you're in a burning out phase and it's mild to moderate, then of course, if you have a long weekend and you go off and play golf and whatever, you'd expect to bounce back completely to normal after that period. If it's more severe, you might have to apply additional de-stressing strategies, which might be mindfulness or meditation. If you're in that fine art, burnt out stage, then that's going to involve, as I said, looking at the personality, modifying that as much as can, not only taking time off, but reevaluating whether you can come back to the same job or the same career, and reworking your work-life balance. So there's no simple formula. And as I say, I think there are two key categories, the burnt out phase and the burning out phase, and the management therefore differs, and the capacity to recover differs dramatically. So just to repeat myself, if you're just simply exhausted, but you describe it as you're going burning out, then a long weekend and a game of golf will probably fix everything. We're actually using the term, I think, too readily at times.
Okay. Yes, that makes sense.
The people in that burnt out phase, they can be divided, I think, again into a couple of groups. Those who, and we capture those again in the book, a couple of vignettes of people who, one is a doctor in the United States who actually wrote an article in a leading American journal, and we have a cut down version of that, and he just completely came up with a new balance to his life. And when people apply that logically and sensibly, they can do quite well. However, there is another group of people who just can't step out of the game. And I find this a lot in, say, Canberra public servants. They're in a job, they're incredibly diligent, they're working hard, but it's failing. And they've taken time off and then they've come back, but they haven't been able to function. HR is putting pressure on them, the boss is putting pressure on them. And basically, they're in a misfit job and they should be out of it. But because they're diligent and reliable and they sort of want to keep on working, they stay there and stay there and stay there. And they get stuck and it's in impasse. And when you get that scenario, it becomes very difficult to shift. Because, because their loyalty and their dutifulness is being applied in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that sounds very much like torture, up to a point. I'm just curious. In that case, in most instances, do the individuals feel trapped?
They wouldn't describe it as feeling trapped.
Okay.
They just see it as that it's their life.
Oh, okay.
And when I would point out that no one is winning, they're not able to function effectively at work. Their bosses are irritated and frustrated because they're not functioning. And therefore, it's not the right fit. And therefore, they need a new scenario to operate in, which all seems very common sense. They might look at me and nod, but getting them to do the move into another position is almost impossible.
Yeah.
They become stuck.
Yeah. Stuck's a better term.
The scenario that I've been describing, most people in that situation do not come to that realization and act on it.
Okay, that's excellent, because I think, to me, that's what I heard you saying as well. I think there's a realization, a lack of self-knowledge and insight into an understanding that, oh, hang on, this is one of the contributing factors here. And then I think sometimes it requires the rug being pulled out from underneath people in order to make changes. So it's interesting, those severe physiological, biological responses can sometimes be the catalyst for change.
Yeah. The problem then becomes that most people, unless they're tyrannical, bullying bosses, are reluctant to do that because the employee is generally a nice person. I mean, that's one of the ironies of burnout, that the people who develop burnout are generally nice people. So therefore, the employer doesn't feel comfortable with telling them, hey, you really do have to get out of here. So in a sense, they're trying to help them, becoming very frustrated, but they are highly unlikely as employers to tell that person to get out. I, as the clinician, might say to the person, you have got to get out. But what's my hit rate over the years? Probably about 10%.
Yeah, I'm almost convinced that you have to have something kind of catalyst, kind of some serious event, to occur sometimes.
Yeah, you need a circuit breaker.
Yeah, it's not until something serious happens to people that sometimes they come to that realization, oh, I might need to make some changes in my life. Earlier you mentioned the diagnostic statistical manual. I understand from a diagnostic point of view in psychiatry, that's the go-to benchmark, the standard. And I'm curious why it's not in the DSM.
Well, as I mentioned, it only made ICD 10 and it made ICD 10, which is the International Classification of Diseases, auspiced by the World Health Organization, in a very vague way. And then in ICD 11, which came out a couple of years ago, it was listed as an occupational phenomenon, and they gave 3 symptoms, but they didn't regard the psychiatric condition. So obviously they didn't see it at a high level. And yet ICD has probably got about 600 different conditions. DSM, which is the American Diagnostic Statistic Manual, has also got about 600 conditions. By not including it, they're obviously saying, well, look, this is not of psychiatric disease, disorder level. However, if you ask yourself a question, is burnout really just another name for chronic stress reaction? And you look at the symptoms in DSM for a chronic stress reaction, you've basically got burnout.
Yeah. So would you say that's just then maybe a little bit of politics to get it into the DSM manual? Or
The diagnostic manuals have always been influenced to some degree by external factors. I mean, obviously, they capture psychiatric manuals capture the substantive disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, blah blah blah, anxiety and depression. But some conditions come in and some go out over time. The most distinguished one was, of course, homosexuality, which was listed in DSM for an extended period of time, and then appropriately taken out a couple of decades ago with recognition that this was not a psychiatric condition. So it was a very good example where um, social factors drove that decision, not psychiatric science.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, what we're seeing is basically every university in this country, it requires its employees to take a day off a month to avoid burnout, for instance.
Okay.
And of course, those who are at risk of burnout never take the day off.
Yeah, good point.
And in America, they have large numbers of companies that are going around introducing stress relieving strategies within companies because big companies know that burnout costs them a hell of a lot of money. Why? Because of absenteeism. People with burnout don't get to work. Secondly, presenteeism. They get to work, but they can't turn their brain on. And thirdly, they're highly likely to leave the workforce. So if you've got a group of diligent, reliable, conscientious people, you don't want to lose them.
Yeah.
So therefore, it is taken seriously in America in particular, and increasingly in Australia,
Okay.
where people are trying to prevent the onset of burnout.
For my thinking was more, if it's not in the DSM manual, it doesn't count.
Yes, being included or excluded actually doesn't mean a hell of a lot. I mean,
Yes, okay.
trichotillomania is in DSM, where you twirl your hair. I mean, that's pretty trivial. That's pretty trivial.
No, fair point. That's you are right. It's funny enough the terminology is not necessarily connected with burnout. They use different, kind of terms, but you are right. It's they call them mental health days and all sorts of other things. Yep. And you are right. People who generally have burnout don't take it off, or they're at home working, so they're not really taking it off.
And the laid back people who are never going to develop burnout will always take the day off.
Yeah. All right. So next question I have for you is around the Sydney burnout measure, and I found that extremely useful. And if anyone wants it, they can find it easily online. You can just search Sydney burnout measure and you can find it. In your evolving understanding around burnout, are there any areas a future version of the measure might need to include?
No, I think that we cover the key constructs, and the dominant model of burnout is what I call a triadic model. It just has three symptoms. You're exhausted, there's a lack of empathy or feeling, and you've got decreased performance. Now, decreased performance is probably a consequence of the first two, so you've only got two symptoms. What we found in our research and what we built into our burnout measure were a number of other components. For instance, cognitive impairment. And that was described way back. Remember when I was talking about the period in Egypt where acedia was described? The priests were describing cognitive impairment. That isn't in most modern measures. So we've got that. We've got insularity. We've got a whole range of other symptoms captured. However, there are limitations to our measure, as there are to all burnout measures. And I just cover it very quickly. If you've got burnout, you will score highly on the measure. So it's got what we call good sensitivity, but its specificity is only moderate. And by that, I mean, if you've got severe depression, you'll probably get a reasonably high score. If you've got severe anxiety, you've probably got a high score. If you're anemic and you're fatigued and exhausted and can't fire up, you'll get a high score. If you're having chemotherapy, blah, 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 blah. So the point I want to make is that the Sydney burnout measure, like all others, should just be seen as a screening measure. And then you need a good clinician to clarify whether in fact that is the key diagnosis.
Okay. No, very
Yep.
useful. No, very useful. I know there's some descriptors, at the end of your book here, talking about the different categories and so on and so forth. But really, that's the first step around identification. But then you need to go to a clinician in order to kind of help you make sense of and that and make steps towards an intervention plan of sorts.
And then the problem is, which clinician should you go to? Because, as I said, most of us as clinicians have never been trained in the nuances of burnout, particularly how to diagnose it, and therefore the risk of misdiagnosis and falsely calling it, say, depression, and inappropriately treating it is very, very high.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's wow. Okay. That sounds concerning. um,
But
and
that's actually one of the reasons why we wrote the book, to try to increase awareness of all these nuances.
yeah. 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 And it does matter because obviously the right diagnosis matters in terms of treatment plans. Yeah, so I'll get to treatment plans in a minute. It was interesting. I said when I was reading it, I was surprised for me anyway when I saw the perfectionism as a personality trait as a predisposing, kind of entity, and that surprised me. I knew about burnout, but that surprised me
Yeah,
when I was reading it.
yeah. That I think is probably one of the most important aspects of our model. That is, we have, as I said earlier, a diathesis stress model. We are arguing that you need to look at whether there are predisposing factors. And while perfectionism, dutifulness is the number one, type A personality is at times also a factor, people who are very driven. So there can be a number of personality styles, but the most common one is dutifulness, reliability, perfectionism.
Let's just turn to a little bit around treatment plans, intervention strategies. So, what evidence based strategies have you found most effective in preventing and mitigating burnout?
Well, I wouldn't call any of them evidence-based
Sure.
because, as I mentioned, the meta-analysis of treatments for burnout failed to identify any treatment as being definitively effective. So there isn't an evidence base. So the way we handled it was, we said to people with burnout, what do you find most helpful for your state? What have you found most helpful? And by and large, they said taking time off, exercise, which had to be strenuous exercise. Um, they found of all the psychological therapies, mindfulness and meditation to be effective. So they're the factors that are nominated by people who've gone through that state, and so that is all helpful. But in these large samples, and we've now had 3 samples of about 5,000 people in total, no one has ever said, okay, addressing my perfectionism was definitive. So you need to also think at the clinical level and say, okay, patients are reporting de-stressing strategies, but they're not aware of the diathesis stress model and looking at what may be the predisposing factors. Everyone is emphasizing the precipitants, the drivers of the state, not the vulnerability factors. And therefore, that's where our intervention model differs, because we're saying that if there are predisposing factors, then they need to be addressed, not just the precipitants.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it was interesting. In your book, you talk about 3 things. Obviously, you can make work changes, whatever that might look like. Um,
Yep.
and obviously de-stressing strategies, and then obviously dealing with perfectionism. It's interesting. De-stressing strategies is the one that's inevitably rolled out pretty much
Yeah.
everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah. Just coming back to the actual stresses, we have an appendix and we list the stresses that have been demonstrated historically. And they're not just excessive work hours, but there are others such as, the lighting might be excessive, or there may be too much noise, or your value system may be being compromised. So we encourage people to go through that appendix and checklist every one that is relevant to their story so that they can then work out what strategies might be able to be employed. So that is an important nuance to identify the trigger and then work out a specific strategy.
Yeah, I remember reading through. I think there was about 13 of them. Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the toxic workplace.
Yep.
Interesting enough, I had a colleague say to me, "Oh, he was working in a toxic workplace A, and then he went to another workplace, and then of course he thought logically, oh, look, if I just leave toxic workplace A, that should mitigate or deal with the burnout." But then, of course, it didn't. So you are right that there is something obviously more at play other than just work. There are other contributing factors. That's a good segue into my next question around. So, if there's any employers or leaders or senior managers who are listening to this, what advice would you kind of give them in terms of preventing burnout?
Well, most of it is pretty common sense. And if they're a good manager, they would look at their actual organization and see whether they have got, stresses, and I'll come back to that. If they've got an employer who is looking as though they're struggling, or an employee comes to them and says, "Look, I am struggling," then having a deep and meaningful conversation uh, is very appropriate. Um, but there are other things that I think are even more salient here. If we address it by saying, what are the key drivers of this seeming epidemic in burnout? Then the key factor seems to be that we as employees are always on. We're looking at our emails late at night, we don't turn our phones off, and so on and so forth. So if you're an employer and you wanted to reduce burnout, you might say to all your employees, you have to turn your phone off and become uncontactable after, say, 6 p.m., and you're not allowed at weekends. And of course, all the perfectionistic, dutiful people won't stick to that. So you have to outflank them and do something like that. And then you work your way, as a boss, you work your way through the whole organization and see whether you can reduce this constant being on phenomenon.
Mm. Yeah, look, I agree. It's hard not to see the contribution digital technology has played here. Maybe, I don't know what it is about digital technology, but if you're not self-disciplined, it's a recipe for disaster, really. It's what contribution do you think technology, particularly technology, I'm thinking here, has played in burnout?
Well, as I just emphasised,
Yeah,
I think it's the big factor
yeah.
of constantly being on, connected
Mm.
to your technology. I mean, just look at the average street in a suburb between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and you're seeing all these school children walking along with their face in a phone,
Yeah, yeah.
not talking to each other. And, that's when they get home at night, they're going to do that through to 2 or 3 in the morning. So I mean, a lot of people think burnout is going to be dominated by people in the workforce. Burnout is not uncommon in senior high school students. It is
Okay.
increasingly common as a phenomenon.
No, thank you for mentioning that because I was going to ask you why it just tends to be a workplace phenomenon. Because I was going to say you could be a carer
Yep.
and you could also experience burnout.
Yep.
Do you think research will address that? Do you think, or
It's already been addressed, and the problem again is with the measures.
mm,
So, for instance, if you look at, say, studies looking at the prevalence of burnout in doctors, the various studies show a range of 0% to 85%. Now, obviously, that's a nonsense, and it's coming as a consequence of the differing measures being applied, the cutoffs being different. But if we look, say, at medical profession, then 1 in 3 doctors will be experiencing burnout at any one time, and 2 out of 3 over their career. And we look at differing other careers, then we also can get reasonable estimates of prevalence. Um, so it does vary. And of course, you're right, during COVID, when mothers were having to homeschool their children, work a job, look after their partner, etc., often elderly relatives as well. they were in the sandwich generation, and rates of burnout were very high. That's another issue because, in fact, many of the burnout researchers and the initial work with developing the massive burnout inventory limited to those in formal employment. And there's been a lack of recognition that burnout can be experienced by those who are not formally employed. And we've just covered that territory.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for that. That's very useful. So, what advice would you give someone who's maybe experiencing early signs of burnout?
Well, first of all, seek clarification as to whether it's burnout or something else. Secondly, if it's looking like burnout, identify the triggers, and that's why we have that appendix in the book. Then see whether de-stressing strategies come into play, work out. If they don't, then you have to determine what might be the perpetuating factors, and they may be personality or work circumstances. And then you need to address each of those. So I think it's a fairly logical progression process.
Last question, and then maybe if you could tell us a bit about some of your upcoming or potential research projects you might have on burnout.
Well, we're continuing to pursue issues that we think need tidying up, particularly the issue we discussed earlier: how do you best separate out burnout from depression? We're also doing quite a lot of work on what de-stressing strategies people have found helpful. We are undertaking a major review of all the personality styles that may predispose and seeing which ones are higher order and lower order. But I think we've done the most important tasks along the way. That is, how best to define burnout, and we've come up with a much richer, broader model. We have distinguished between burning out and being burnt out. We've argued for a diathesis stress model rather than just simply a stress model. And then we've argued for the implications of that model in terms of differing management strategies. So I think we've addressed 80% of the substantive issues. And at the moment, we're in a sort of tidying up phase.
Excellent, excellent. And I just want to obviously make mention of your book. I've got it here in my hand here, Burnout, A Guide to Identifying Burnout and Pathways to Recovery. And obviously, Gordon Parker here, Professor Parker here, has been good enough to talk to me. And Gabriella Tavella and Kerry Ayres, also authors of the book, can be found in any good bookstore. It's published by Allen and Unwin. And I found it very easily online, very easy to purchase, very reasonable price. And I really enjoyed reading it. And I want to say thank you for joining me today. I found it absolutely fascinating. I really have. I really appreciate your time. I know you're very busy. And I want to say thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Steve. It was my pleasure.
I want to thank you for joining us for this fascinating deep dive into burnout with Professor Gordon Parker. Professor Parker's book, Burnout, A Guide to Identifying Burnout and Pathways to Recovery, is truly a game changer. Whether you're a healthcare professional trying to better understand your patients, a manager wanting to create a healthier workplace, or someone personally navigating burnout symptoms, this book offers evidence-based strategies backed by decades of clinical research. It's available at all major bookstores and online retailers, and trust me, it's worth every penny. I also encourage you to explore Black Dog Institute's website. They offer free assessments, digital tools, and resources that can help you understand and manage burnout, depression, and anxiety. Their work literally saves lives, and their resources are accessible to everyone. A massive thank you to our incredible producer, Luke, the truckie from Petrie. He's the unsung hero behind every episode, making audio magic happen behind the scenes. Until next time, stay curious, be kind to yourself if you're feeling burnt out, and as always, think deeply. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz.